She did not knock the second time. By the time Elias Harding opened his cabin door, the woman on his porch was already falling. Snow whipped past her like a living thing, burying her skirts, freezing her hair to her cheeks in dark, tangled ribbons. One hand was still raised as if she had tried to beg the storm itself for mercy. Her knuckles were white. Her lips were blue. Her eyes, when they found his, held nothing but the last dim flicker of someone who had already made peace with dying. Elias caught her before she struck the frozen boards. She was ice cold, too light, too still. For one terrible heartbeat, he thought she was dead. Then her lips moved. A single word, barely louder than the wind. Please. And in that word, something inside him cracked open. Something he had buried 7 winters ago beneath a lonely cottonwood tree, beside a woman who would never speak again, and a child who had never drawn breath. He had sealed it shut with silence and work and years of talking to no one but a dog. But this stranger's voice, thin as a thread and just as fragile, reached through all of it. He pulled her inside and kicked the door closed with his heel. The wind slammed against the wood as if furious he had stolen something from it. The winter of 1891 came down on the Montana Territory like judgment. Snow did not drift that year. It attacked. It clotted cabins, swallowed fences whole, and turned men into ghosts wandering through white silence. Cattle froze, standing upright in the fields, their eyes still open, their breath long gone. Horses pressed together in barns and trembled through the nights. Wells sealed shut overnight, their ropes stiff as iron, their buckets frozen to the stone. The rivers stopped moving. The trees groaned under the weight of ice, and sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, a branch would snap with a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and final, echoing across the valley with nothing to stop it. Even the sky seemed to forget it had ever held color, turning the same flat, merciless white, from horizon to horizon, day after day, until the world felt less like a place and more like a punishment. Old-timers in Redstone would later say it was the worst winter since the territory was settled. Some said it was God testing them. Others said it was simply the land reminding them who was in charge. Elias Harding had lived through hard winters before, 12 of them on this land, alone for the last 7. He had built his cabin with his own hands on a rise above Cedar Hollow, choosing the spot because his wife Lenore had loved the view. She had stood right here on a September afternoon with the grass still gold around her ankles and said, "This is where we will grow old, Elias." He had believed her. He had cut every log with that belief singing in his chest. Thick pine, tight seams chinked with clay and horsehair, a stone hearth wide enough to hold heat long after the fire burned low. A bedroom with a window facing east so the morning sun would wake them gently. A loft for the children they planned to have, 2 or 3 or as many as God allowed. Instead, the cabin had become a tomb with a fire in it, and Elias, its only ghost. The loft stayed empty. The east window let in light that no one watched. The chair he had built for Lenore sat in the corner untouched, gathering dust so thick it looked like fur. He had not moved it. He could not bring himself to. Moving it would mean admitting she was never coming back to sit in it, and some truths, even after 7 years, still had teeth. But nothing about this night felt ordinary. Something about the weight of this woman in his arms, the way her fingers curled against his shirt even in unconsciousness, the way Boone pressed his nose to her hand and whined instead of barking, told Elias that the storm had carried in more than snow. He laid her on the rug before the hearth. She was young, mid-20s maybe. Her dress was thin cotton, faded blue calico that had been washed so many times it had gone soft as old paper. City made, no match for frontier cold. Ice clung to her lashes like tiny jewels, beautiful and deadly. Her lips had turned the color of a bruise. "Stay with me," he muttered. He stripped off her frozen coat, stiff as bark, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. The wool from his own bed. The quilt Lenore had stitched their first winter together, the one with the crooked star pattern she had laughed about. When he hesitated at her soaked dress, modesty fought necessity. Necessity won. He turned his back long enough to give her dignity while he found dry clothes. One of his shirts, flannel, too large by half. Wool trousers that would swallow her whole. He set them beside her and stepped away. When he turned again, she had managed to pull herself upright. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with buttons, but she did it herself. She did not ask for help. That alone told him something important. This woman, whoever she was, still had fight left in her. He pressed a tin cup of hot coffee into her trembling hands. She wrapped both palms around it as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. Her dark eyes lifted to his, and he saw something there that went beyond cold and fear. He saw the look of someone who had been broken carefully, deliberately, over time. "Thank you," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment. The firelight moved across her face, painting shadows beneath her cheekbones, catching the damp sheen of melting ice in her hair. She was not beautiful in the way painting suggested beauty. She was beautiful the way a winter creek is beautiful. Still on the surface, running deep beneath. "Who left you out there?" he asked. Something flickered across her gaze. Shame, fury, humiliation. All three, braided together so tightly they had become one thing. She looked down at the coffee in her hands. "My husband," she said quietly. Elias's jaw tightened, because he had buried a wife once, held her hand while the life drained out of her, and the baby inside her fell silent. He knew the difference between losing someone and being thrown away, and he heard in this woman's voice a wound that no blizzard could have carved. The fire burned low and steady, throwing gold across the cabin walls. She sat wrapped in his flannel shirt, her dark hair slowly drying in uneven waves around her shoulders. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, and with it, a quiet dignity that cold and exhaustion had not managed to erase. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said after a long silence, "from Boston. Elias Harding." She looked around the cabin as if memorizing it, the rough beams overhead, the rifle resting on pegs above the hearth, the ladder leading to the loft, the single plate, single cup, single chair at the table. Everything built for one. "You live here alone?" "Yes." No explanation followed. None was needed. The cabin spoke for itself. Outside, the wind screamed against the shutters like something trying to get back in. Inside, something quieter settled between them. Not comfort exactly, but the faint beginning of safety. "You said your husband left you," Elias prompted gently. Clara let out a short, hollow breath. She held the tin cup tighter. "Mail order husband." 2 words. They told him enough. But she continued, and he let her, because he could see she needed to speak the wound aloud before it poisoned her from the inside. She stared into the fire as she talked. Her voice was low and steady, almost rehearsed, as if she had played this humiliation over and over in her mind until the edges wore smooth. We wrote letters for 4 months. He described fertile land, a large house, a life where I would never have to sew by candlelight again. Her lips curved without humor, a smile that held no warmth. He sent money for my train ticket, said I would be his wife the moment I arrived. And was he? She shook her head slowly. When he saw me at the station, he barely spoke. On the drive to his place, he kept looking at me like I had cheated him somehow. Her fingers tightened on the cup until the knuckles whitened. He said I was not what he expected. Meaning? Meaning I was not young enough, or pretty enough, or whatever foolish image he had built inside his head from a few lines of careful handwriting. The words were calm. The wound beneath them was not. It pulsed like a second heartbeat, raw and deep. He kept me 3 weeks, she continued, said I owed him the cost of my passage. I cooked, cleaned, scrubbed his floors on my knees, and every day, every single day, he told me what a disappointment I was, that he had paid for a wife and received a burden. She swallowed. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. Clara Whitfield, Elias was beginning to understand, did not cry easily. Yesterday morning he drove me 1 mile from his homestead in the wagon, pulled the horse to a stop in the middle of the road, told me to walk back to town. She paused. In a blizzard. Yes. Elias stared into the flames, anger rising inside him slow and controlled, like water finding its level. He knew the man she meant, Silas Drummond. A hard rancher 3 miles south. Sharp eyes, sharper temper, the kind of man who measured everything by what it cost him and treated anything that failed to profit him as waste. Elias had seen him whip a horse for stumbling, had watched him fire a ranch hand in December and felt the wrongness of it settle in his gut like a stone. But he had said nothing. That silence pressed against him now with a weight he had not expected. You could have died, Elias said quietly. I nearly did. She met his gaze, steady despite the fear still lingering at the edges. I saw your light through the snow. I thought it was heaven, or delirium. I was not sure there was a difference anymore. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he said, You are safe here. She studied him the way a person studies a bridge before deciding whether it will hold. Carefully, without hurry, testing every plank with her eyes before trusting her weight to it. Why? She asked softly. You do not know me. Elias leaned back in his chair. The fire reflected in his pale eyes, making them look almost gold. Because I know what it is to be alone in the cold, he said. And I know what it means when someone opens a door. Clara's expression shifted. Not gratitude, not yet. Something closer to belief. The faintest crack in the wall she had built around herself, just wide enough for a sliver of light to pass through. Boone padded over and rested his chin on her knee. She placed one hand on the dog's broad head and kept the other wrapped around the cup, and in that small gesture, warmth and weariness, and the first fragile thread of trust, Elias saw something he had not seen inside his cabin in 7 years. Life. The storm did not break the next day, or the day after that. For 4 long days, Cedar Hollow vanished beneath a white sky and a white earth, as if the world beyond Elias Harding's cabin had been erased entirely. The valley became a blank page. No roads, no fences, no horizon. Just snow and silence and the steady pulse of the fire inside the cabin. They were trapped. And in that trapping, something unexpected began to grow. Clara insisted on earning her keep by the second morning. She rose before he did, moving stiffly, still sore, still favoring her left side where the cold had bitten deepest. But she was upright, and she was working. "You saved my life," she said firmly, tying back her hair with a strip of cloth. "The least I can do is cook." Elias almost told her she owed him nothing, but he saw something in the way she stood, in the way she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. It was not pride exactly, something deeper, something more essential. Dignity. She needed to stand in this cabin not as a rescued creature, but as a woman who carried her own weight. He understood that need because he carried one just like it. The need to be useful, the need to matter, the need to prove that you are more than the worst thing that has happened to you. So he let her. She moved carefully at first. The stove was temperamental, running hot on one side and cold on the other, a problem Elias had never bothered to fix because burning food did not matter when no one else was eating it. The flour was coarse. The dried beans were stubborn, requiring hours of soaking. The salt pork was tough as saddle leather. Yet somehow, what she placed before him that evening tasted better than anything he had eaten in years. A thick stew, rich with beans and onion, and a pinch of something he could not name, served with cornbread that was golden on the outside and tender within. He ate slowly, surprised by the care in every bite. "You have done this before," he said quietly after the first spoonful. "My mother taught me," she replied, watching him eat with an expression that was almost shy. "She used to say that food is the only kind of love you can give a stranger without asking permission." That sentence hung in the air between them. It did not fade. It settled into the walls of the cabin like smoke, into the wood and the stone and the silence. And Elias felt it in his chest, like something he had forgotten how to name. He had not tasted love in a long time. They fell into a rhythm without speaking of it. It happened the way seasons change, gradually, and then all at once. Until one morning, Elias realized they had built something that felt dangerously close to a life together. He rose before dawn to check the horses, break ice at the trough with a rusted pick, and shovel a narrow path to the barn through snow that reached his thighs. The cold bit his face and numbed his fingers, but he welcomed it. Cold was honest. Cold did not pretend to be something it was not. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin had already changed. She stirred the fire back to life each morning and brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint. The smell met him at the door, rich and dark and startlingly alive, and each time he stepped inside, he felt the same small shock of re-entry, like a man surfacing from deep water. He mended harness and chopped wood. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, patched his shirts with stitches so small and even they looked like they had been sewn by a machine, and organized the shelves he had not touched since Lenore died. She found jars of preserves he had forgotten, sorted nails by size, arranged the pantry so that everything had a place and a purpose. "You do not have to do all that," he told her one afternoon, watching her fold blankets with military precision. "I need to," she said without looking up. "Why?" "If I stop moving, I remember." "Remember what?" A pause, her hands stilled on the wool. "The look on his face when he left me in the road. the way he did not even turn around. Elias did not press further. He knew that kind of memory. The kind that lives not in the mind, but in the body, coiled at the base of the spine, waiting for stillness to strike. He had his own version, the weight of Lenore growing lighter in his arms, the terrible silence when the baby should have cried, the sound of a shovel hitting frozen earth in the dark. Loss came in many shapes. His had been a slow drowning. Hers had been a door slammed shut. On the third evening, she found the small stack of books beside the hearth. 3 volumes, worn at the edges, their spines cracked from years of careful reading. She looked up at him with genuine surprise. "You read?" "When the weather is bad." "May I?" He handed her the warmest volume without a word. A collection of frontier stories, some true, some half-true, all written in a voice that understood loneliness. Her voice, when she began to read aloud, was steady and warm, like a creek running over smooth stones. Not dramatic, not performative, simply present. She read the way her mother must have taught her to cook, with care and without show, letting the thing itself carry the weight. The fire crackled. Boone sighed heavily at their feet, his tail thumping once against the floorboards before he settled. Elias listened, not just to the story, but to the sound of someone filling his cabin with life again. The sound of breath and voice, and the soft turn of a page. The sound of a room that held 2 people instead of 1. For the first time in 7 years, the silence did not feel like a grave. On the 5th morning, the wind stopped. Elias woke to a silence so complete, so absolute, that for a moment he thought he had gone deaf. He rose from his bedroll near the hearth and crossed to the window. When he pushed back the shutter, his breath caught and held. The storm had carved the valley into something sacred. Snow lay smooth and endless in every direction, glowing beneath a pale sunrise that painted the peaks in shades of rose and amber. The cottonwood behind the cabin stood coated in ice, each branch glittering like something from a dream. The sky had remembered its color at last, a blue so deep and clear it looked like it might shatter if you touched it. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of the ladder. Clara stepped down from the loft and came to stand beside him at the window. She wore his flannel shirt over her dress, sleeves rolled twice at the wrists, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She looked out at the valley and drew in a slow breath. "Is it always this beautiful?" she whispered. "Not always," he said. "But when it is, it makes the hard parts worth it." They stood shoulder to shoulder without touching, but the space between them felt smaller than it had 4 days ago, as if the blizzard had pressed the walls of the cabin inward, drawing everything closer, drawing them closer. The work of digging out took most of the day. Elias shoveled a path to the barn while Clara carried water and fed the chickens that had survived in a sheltered corner near the cabin wall. She moved slowly but steadily, refusing every suggestion to go back inside and rest. "You will catch cold," he warned. "I have already survived worse," she replied, though her breath came in small clouds that hung in the frozen air like tiny prayers. By afternoon, they had cleared enough to move freely. The sun had warmed the air just enough to make the snow sparkle, and everywhere Elias looked, water dripped from eaves and branches and fence posts, the first quiet signs of thaw. They sat together on the porch steps, exhaustion settling into their bones, steam rising from the cups of coffee Clara had brought out. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. He knew what she meant. The storm was over. The road would be passable within a day or two. Silas Drummond still lived 3 miles south. The world was about to rush back in with all its complications and cruelties, and this strange, suspended peace they had built inside the cabin would have to face it. "You could go into town," Elias said carefully. "Find work. I can lend you money for a train east if that is what you want." "And if I do not want to go back east?" He looked at her fully then. Her face was flushed from cold and effort. Strands of dark hair had escaped her scarf and curled against her temples. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a question. And behind the question, something that looked remarkably like hope. "Then you could stay," he said slowly. "Spring is coming. I could use help with the fencing. And I have grown used to someone reading by the fire." A faint smile touched her mouth. The first real smile he had seen from her. It changed her whole face, softened it, opened it, made it look like a window with the curtain finally pulled back. "You would let me stay?" "I would." "Why?" He considered the truth, all of it. The loneliness that had become so familiar he had stopped noticing it. The sound of her voice filling rooms that had been silent for 7 years. The taste of food made with care instead of obligation. The way she stood up straight even when the world pushed her down. "Because I see strength in you," he said. "And because this place has been quiet too long." Clara looked out across the valley. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge, painting the snow in shades of lavender and pale gold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled above the tree line, riding a current of air that was just beginning to warm. She turned back to him. "I would like to stay," she said softly, "if the offer is real." "It is real." They did not shake hands. They did not need to. Some agreements are sealed not with ink or grip, but with the simple act of choosing the same silence together, of sitting beside someone and letting the quiet say what words cannot. They simply sat together on the porch of a cabin built for a family that never came, beneath a sky turning the color of a promise, watching the valley breathe again after the longest storm either of them had known. And something new took root between them, fragile as first light, steady as the earth beneath the snow. Neither of them named it, neither of them needed to. It was enough for now to sit in its warmth and let it grow. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. The quilt with the crooked star lay folded on the chair Lenore had never sat in, and for the first time, it did not look like a relic. It looked like something waiting to be used again. Clara's shawl hung beside it on the hook near the door, still damp from the snow, already taking its place among the things that belonged. The road would open tomorrow. The world would return with all its sharp edges and hard questions. Silas Drummond was still out there, 3 miles south, and whatever darkness lived inside that man had not been buried by the snow. It would come back. Clara knew it. Elias knew it. The knowing sat between them like a stone neither was ready to lift. But tonight the fire was warm. The coffee was strong. The dog slept at their feet with his nose tucked under his tail. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something worth walking toward, one step at a time. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like a woman entering a room where someone is sleeping, careful not to disturb what the winter had laid to rest. Snow softened along the fence lines first. Then water began to run in thin silver threads down the hillsides, carving shallow paths through the frozen ground. Patches of brown earth appeared like shy confessions beneath the white, small and tentative, as if the land itself was not yet sure the storm had truly passed. The cottonwood behind the cabin released its grip on winter one branch at a time, ice falling from its limbs in bright, shattering pieces that caught the light like broken glass. The air lost its edge in the afternoons, warming just enough for a man to work without gloves, though mornings still bit hard and the frost clung to the cabin windows until past 8. Clara stayed, not as a guest, not as a burden, not as a debt to be repaid, but as something in between, something that did not yet have a name and did not need one. She learned the rhythm of the homestead with the same quiet determination she had shown the night she survived the blizzard. Every task she approached as if it were a test she intended to pass, not for Elias, not for anyone watching, but for herself. For the woman she was building out of the wreckage of the one Silas Drummond had tried to destroy. She milked the cow with clumsy patience, her fingers stiff and uncertain around the teats, the animal stamping and swishing its tail in protest. The first morning she managed half a pail and came inside with her forearms aching. The second morning she managed a full pail. By the end of the week, the cow stood calm and the milk came steady, and Clara carried the pail to the kitchen with a posture that said more than any words could. She gathered eggs with scratched hands, reaching beneath hens that pecked and fluttered and regarded her with small, suspicious eyes. She split kindling with awkward swings that improved day by day until the wood fell clean. She burned one batch of biscuits so badly the smoke filled the cabin and hung in the rafters for hours, and when Elias opened the door to let the air clear, he heard something he had not heard inside these walls in 7 years. Laughter. Her laughter, low and surprised and entirely real, the kind that comes not from joy but from the absurd mercy of still being alive and burning biscuits instead of freezing in a ditch. She stood at the stove with flour on her chin and her hands raised in mock surrender, and the sound she made filled the room the way sunlight fills a window, not forced, not trying, simply there. Elias found himself listening for it after that, waiting for it, counting the hours between one laugh and the next, the way a farmer counts the days between rains. "You do not have to prove anything," he told her one afternoon when she had scrubbed the kitchen table until her knuckles were raw and pink, the wood beneath them gleaming like it had not gleamed in years. She did not look up. Her hands kept moving. The cloth made small circles on the grain. "I am not proving," she said. "I am claiming." She paused then. The cloth went still. "Claiming this place. My right to stand in it." The words settled heavily in his chest. She was not fighting him. She was fighting the memory of being discarded. Every board she scrubbed, every egg she gathered, every biscuit she burned and laughed about was Clara Whitfield planting her feet in the ground and daring the world to move her again. Elias understood that kind of war. He had fought one of his own for 7 years, a quiet war against silence and memory and the gravitational pull of grief. He had won most of the battles and lost a few, and the ones he lost still lived in the dark corners of the cabin where dust collected and light did not reach. That night, after supper, Clara found the small shawl still hanging on a hook near the door. It was pale blue wool, hand-knitted, worn thin at the edges from years of being pulled close around someone's shoulders. She touched it gently, the way you touch something that belongs to the dead, carefully, with reverence. "She must have been kind," Clara said softly. Elias went still. His hands, which had been wiping down the rifle barrel with an oiled cloth, stopped moving entirely. The cabin held its breath. "She was," he answered after a long moment. His voice was quieter than usual, which was saying something, because Elias Harding was not a man given to volume. "Kind, stubborn, braver than I ever was." Clara waited. She did not push. She simply stood there with her fingers resting on the shawl, giving him space the way you give a wounded animal space, present but not pressing. "Her name was Lenore," he said. And then he stopped. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the fire and stayed there, fixed on the flames, as if they held something only he could see. Clara let the silence stand. She removed her hand from the shawl and moved to the other side of the room to wash the dishes. The sound of water and the clink of tin filled the space between them, and it was enough. She understood that some doors open only a crack at first. You do not push them, you wait. You let the person on the other side decide how wide to swing them. The door to Lenore would open eventually, but not tonight. 3 weeks after the storm, they rode into town together. Clara insisted. She had been working toward this moment the way a carpenter works toward a wall that is finally plumb, carefully, measuring twice, before committing. She tied her bonnet beneath her chin with steady fingers and straightened the collar of her dress. The same faded blue calico she had arrived in, now washed and pressed and carrying within its threads the strange dignity of survival. "I will not live hiding," she said as she climbed onto the wagon seat. "If I am staying, I face them." Elias knew who she meant. Cedar Hollow was small. Word traveled faster than wind across open ground. A single woman living in a widower's cabin would stir talk the way a stick stirs a creek, and the water would not settle until someone forced it to. He hitched the wagon without argument. If she was ready to face it, he would stand beside her while she did. He glanced at her once as he guided the horses onto the road. She sat upright, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her eyes fixed on the distance. She looked like a woman walking into a courtroom, composed and certain, and carrying the full weight of her own truth. The road to town was muddy with snowmelt. The wagon wheels cut dark lines through the softening earth, and the horses moved carefully, picking their way around puddles that reflected a sky the color of old pewter. Neither Clara nor Elias spoke during the ride. The valley opened around them in stages, meadows giving way to low hills, then to the scattering of buildings that marked the edge of Redstone. It was not a large town. A general store, a saloon, a church with a bell tower that tilted slightly to the east, a handful of houses with smoke rising from their chimneys. A town built by people who had come here looking for something and stayed because leaving would have meant admitting they had not found it. The town of Redstone lay quiet beneath a pale spring sky. Smoke curled from chimneys. Horses stamped beside the general store, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Curtains shifted in windows as the wagon rolled past. Eyes followed. Mouths moved behind glass. The town was watching, the way small towns always watch, with equal measures of curiosity and judgment. Inside the store, old Mr. Halford looked up from behind his counter with mild surprise. He was a lean man with spectacles that sat too low on his nose and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. "Well now," he said, his eyes landing on Clara. "Seems winter brought more than snow." Elias gave him a steady look. "This is Clara Whitfield. She is staying at my place." Clara stepped forward before the whispers could start. She did not wait for introductions or explanations or the careful dance of small-town diplomacy. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the store where ears were pretending not to listen. "I was engaged to Silas Drummond through a mail order contract," she said. "He abandoned me in the blizzard. Mr. Harding saved my life. That is the whole story." The store went quiet. A tin of tobacco sat forgotten in Mr. Halford's hand. A woman near the dry goods shelf turned fully around to stare. Clara did not flinch. She stood the way Elias had seen her stand that first night, straight-backed, chin level, refusing to be smaller than the moment demanded. Then Mr. Halford nodded slowly. "Well," he muttered, "sounds like Drummond showed his true colors." Others drifted closer. Questions followed, careful at first, then more direct, the way people ask questions when they sense the truth is being offered freely. Clara answered each one calmly. Where was she from? How long had she been at the Harding Ranch? Did she plan to stay? She answered without trembling, without shame, without the defensive edge of someone who expects to be disbelieved. Near the back of the store, a woman in a gray dress watched with sharp, appraising eyes. Prudence Loomis was her name, and she ran the sewing circle in Redstone like a general runs a regiment. Nothing happened in this town without her knowing, and very little happened without her approval. She did not speak during Clara's account. She simply listened. And when it was over, she gave Clara a single nod, brief and firm, the kind of nod that said more than 100 words of welcome. Clara saw it, and something in her shoulders loosened just barely, just enough to notice. Outside, as they loaded flour and coffee and a sack of dried beans into the wagon bed, a voice cut across the street like a blade through paper. "Well, I will be." Silas Drummond stood on the porch of the saloon, a glass in his hand, his eyes sharp as broken glass catching the light. He had the build of a man accustomed to command. Broad shoulders, clean boots polished to a shine that seemed deliberately wrong for a ranching town, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He looked the way a loaded rifle looks, still and quiet, and full of something that could ruin you if you stood too close. Clara's hand tightened around the sack of flour she was carrying. Her fingers pressed into the burlap until the knuckles went white, but she did not drop it. She did not step behind Elias. She did not move at all. Silas stepped down from the porch slowly, each boot landing with deliberate weight on the wooden steps. He crossed the dusty street with the easy stride of a man who believed every road belonged to him. "You look well," he said, stopping 6 feet from the wagon. His tone was casual, conversational, the tone of a man commenting on the weather or the price of grain, but his eyes held something different, something cold and possessive and entirely without warmth. "I am," Clara said. "I was told you had taken shelter." His gaze slid to Elias, measured him, dismissed him, and returned to Clara. "Seems you have made yourself comfortable." "She made herself alive," Elias replied evenly. Silas's smile thinned. It did not disappear. It simply narrowed, the way a snake narrows its body before it strikes. "Careful, Harding. That woman is bound to me by contract. Paper signed. Money exchanged. You broke that contract when you left her to die. Misunderstandings." Silas shrugged with one shoulder. "Misunderstandings can be corrected." Clara stepped forward before Elias could answer. She placed herself between Elias and Drummond the way a person places themselves between a fire and something they intend to save. She looked directly into the face of the man who had driven her into a blizzard and left her there, and her voice when she spoke was low and steady and harder than anything Elias had heard from her before. "I would rather freeze again," she said quietly, "than step foot on your land." The street had gone silent. Every person within earshot had stopped moving. A horse stamped. A shutter creaked. The world waited. Silas studied her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, as if he were chewing on something bitter he could not quite swallow. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound with no pleasure in it. "Enjoy your borrowed safety," he said. "Everything comes due." He turned and walked back toward the saloon without hurrying, his boots striking the boards with the rhythmic confidence of a man who believed that time was on his side. He did not look back. He did not need to. The threat had been delivered. It hung in the air behind him like smoke. Elias climbed onto the wagon. His jaw was tight. The muscles along his forearms stood out beneath his rolled sleeves. Clara joined him without a word. She placed the flour sack carefully in the wagon bed and folded her hands in her lap, and as they rode home beneath clouds that were starting to gather along the western ridge, she spoke. "It is not over." "No," Elias agreed. "It is not." The valley felt different after that, quieter, watchful, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. Elias did not speak of it much, but his actions spoke loud enough. He cleaned the rifle that night and leaned it against the wall within arm's reach of the door. He checked the barn twice before bed. He walked the perimeter of the cabin beneath moonlight, his boots crunching over thinning frost, his eyes scanning the tree line and the fence line and the dark spaces between. Clara noticed everything. She always did. Observation was one of her quiet gifts, the ability to read a room or a person or a silence the way others read books, carefully, noting what was there and what was missing. "He is trying to frighten us," she said as she folded blankets near the hearth. "He is," Elias answered. "And he will try more than words." She looked at him across the room. The fire painted half her face in gold and left the other half in shadow. And in that divided light, she looked like two women at once, the one who had survived the storm and the one who was preparing for the next. "I will not be chased again," she said. "Not by him, not by anyone." Elias studied her for a long moment, and what he saw there was not defiance or bravado or the false courage that comes from anger. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was a woman who had measured the cost of running against the cost of standing still and had chosen the ground beneath her feet. "You will not be," he said quietly. 2 nights later, Elias woke to the sound of Boone growling. The dog stood at the door, hackles raised, his body rigid with attention. A low rumble came from deep in his chest, the kind of sound that means something is out there, something that does not belong. Elias rose without making noise. He took the rifle from the wall and moved to the window. Outside, the moonlight lay cold and silver across the yard, painting everything in shades of pale blue and black. He saw nothing, but Boone did not stop growling. In the morning, Elias found the answer. The fence along the south pasture had been cut, not broken by wind or weight or age, cut cleanly with a tool. 3 sections of wire lay curled on the ground like dead snakes, and through the gap, 6 head of cattle had wandered into the open darkness. He followed the tracks, found hoof prints that did not belong to any horse on his land. found a scrap of rope, thick and new, the kind used on Drummond's ranch. Found the evidence and felt it settle in his stomach like a swallowed stone. This was not a warning. This was the beginning. He spent the day tracking the cattle, found 4 of them 2 miles east, huddled in a draw beside a frozen creek, confused and shivering. The other 2 were gone, lost to the hills, or the cold, or the wolves that still roam the high ridges this time of year. 2 head of cattle, months of feed, a portion of his livelihood sliced away as casually as the wire had been sliced. He returned to the cabin at dusk, tired and grim. Clara met him at the door. She read his face the way she always did, quickly and completely, and the question she asked was not whether something had happened, but what. He told her. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she did not say she was sorry. She did not say she was afraid. She said, "Show me the fence. I will help you mend it tomorrow." But it was not the fence that frightened him. The next morning, Clara went to water the horses and stopped. She stood very still beside the trough, her hand resting on its edge, her body locked in the particular stillness of someone who has found something wrong. Elias came up beside her and looked down. The water in the trough had a strange sheen to it, oily, wrong. And the old bay mare, the one Elias had ridden for 8 years, the one Lenore had named Copper because of the reddish tint in her coat, stood in the corner of the paddock with her head hanging low and her sides heaving. "Something is in the water," Clara said. Elias knelt. He smelled it before he could name it. A chemical bitterness beneath the surface, faint but unmistakable. Someone had poisoned the trough. Copper was already sick. Her eyes were dull, and her breathing was labored, and she did not lift her head when Elias approached. He placed his hand on her neck and felt the heat rolling off her in waves, the furnace of a body trying to fight something it could not see. This horse had carried him through 8 winters, had stood patient while he loaded supplies in the rain, had been the last living thing Lenore ever touched, stroking her muzzle through the barn window the morning before labor began. Losing Copper would not just be losing an animal, it would be losing the last thread that connected him to a time when this ranch had been whole. "I need to ride for the veterinarian in town," he said, his voice tight. "There is no time," Clara said. She was already moving. Into the cabin. Back out again with a bundle of dried herbs she had found in the pantry weeks ago and organized into careful rows without knowing she would ever need them. Peppermint, charcoal from the stove, a handful of dried chamomile. Things her mother had taught her to use when the apothecary was too far and the need was too urgent. "My mother was a healer's daughter," she said, not looking at him, her hands working quickly, crushing the dried leaves in a tin cup and mixing them with warm water. "Before she married my father, she spent her childhood in her grandmother's kitchen learning which plants could save a life and which could take one." She knelt beside Copper with the cup. The horse resisted. Clara spoke to her in a low, even voice, the same voice she used when reading by the fire, steady and unhurried and full of a patience that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than will. She coaxed the mixture past the horse's lips, a little at a time, rubbing Copper's throat to encourage swallowing. Elias watched. There was nothing else he could do. He was a man who knew cattle and fences and how to read weather in the color of the sky. But standing there beside a sick horse in the pale morning light, he was useless. And Clara, The woman he had pulled half dead from his porch 8 weeks ago was not. She stayed with Copper through the afternoon and into the evening. She changed the poultice twice. She kept the horse warm with blankets dragged from the cabin and kept water flowing with a persistence that bordered on stubbornness, dipping a cloth into clean water and pressing it to the horse's lips, again and again, with the patience of someone who has decided that giving up is simply not among the available choices. Boone lay beside her the entire time, his chin on his paws, watching with the serious eyes of a dog who understands when something important is happening and has chosen his side. By nightfall, Copper's breathing had steadied. By morning, the horse was standing on her own, still weak, but alive. Still alive. Elias stood in the barn doorway and watched Clara press her forehead against Copper's neck, her eyes closed, her hand resting on the mare's shoulder. She was exhausted. Her dress was stained with charcoal and sweat and horse saliva. Her hair had come loose and hung in tangled strands around her face. She looked nothing like the careful, composed woman who had introduced herself to Redstone 3 weeks ago. She looked like someone who belonged here. Something shifted inside Elias at that moment. Not suddenly, not like a door slamming open, but like a door that had been closed for 7 years, swinging slowly on its hinges, letting in a light he had forgotten existed. He had respected Clara from the beginning. He had admired her courage, her refusal to break, her ability to stand tall in the wreckage of what had been done to her. But this was different. Watching her save something he loved, watching her kneel in the dirt and fight for a horse's life with nothing but herbs and patience and the knowledge her mother had given her, he felt something that went beyond respect. He felt awe. And beneath the awe, quiet as a heartbeat, something else. Something he was not yet ready to name. He turned and walked back to the cabin before she could see his face. Because Elias Harding had lived alone long enough to know when his expression was saying things his mouth was not prepared to. 2 days later, the marshal rode up. Josiah Cragg was a thin man, weathered by decades of Montana wind and the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent his life standing between other people's anger. He removed his hat before speaking, the way he always did when the news he carried was heavy. "Elias," he nodded. "Miss Whitfield." Clara straightened at the sound of her name. "Drummond has been in town stirring things," the marshal said, still holding his hat. "Claiming theft, claiming you broke a lawful contract." His eyes moved to Clara. "Says he wants you returned." "Returned?" Elias's voice went low. The words sat in his mouth like something rotten. "As his wife, or his property." Cragg shifted uneasily in the saddle. "He is waving papers signed back east. Technically binding, he says." Clara's face drained of color. Her hands, which had been resting at her sides, curled into fists. But she did not step back. She did not look away. She stood on the porch of a cabin that was not yet hers in any legal sense and planted her feet as if the ground itself would have to move before she did. "He abandoned me," she said. "Left me in a blizzard to die." "I know," the marshal replied. "But the law does not always follow decency." Silence stretched across the clearing. The trees along the ridge stood perfectly still. Not even the wind moved. "What happens now?" Elias asked. Cragg hesitated. He looked at the sky, then at the ground, then back at Elias with the expression of a man who wished he had better news to deliver. "If Drummond pushes this, a judge from Helena may come to review the contract. Until then, it is talk." "And if he tries to take her by force?" Elias asked quietly. The marshal met his gaze. "Then he answers to me." There was steel in that statement, but there was also doubt. Josiah Cragg was an honest man and a decent one, but he was one man in a territory where law moved slow and power moved fast, and Silas Drummond had money enough to make both work in his favor. The marshal left soon after. The sound of his horse faded down the trail and was swallowed by the valley. Clara stood very still on the porch for a long time. The afternoon light fell across her shoulders and painted her shadow long and thin on the boards. Boone pressed against her leg, and she placed one hand on his head absently, her eyes fixed on the distance, on the place where the trail bent south toward Drummond's land. "He thinks I am something he bought," she said softly. "You are not." "But the paper says I am." Elias stepped closer, close enough to feel her breath in the cool air, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat, rapid and frightened, betraying the fear her voice refused to carry. "Paper does not decide who you are," he said. "You do." She looked up at him. For the first time since the storm, fear showed clearly in her eyes. Not the wild, desperate fear of a woman freezing to death, but something deeper. The fear of being pulled back into a life she had barely escaped. The fear that the world had already made its decision about her, and nothing she did would change it. "What if the law says I belong to him?" she whispered. Elias did not hesitate. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Some words carry their weight not in volume but in certainty. And the certainty in Elias Harding's voice at that moment was absolute. "Then the law will have to fight me first." Clara's hand found his, her fingers threaded through his tightly, like a person gripping a rope over a long fall. He did not pull away. He did not close the space between them. He simply held on, and she held on. And they stood there on the porch beneath a sky heavy with gathering clouds. Something had changed. Something that could not be unchanged. Not just protection, not just gratitude, not just the bond of two people who had survived the same winter and feared the same enemy. Something deeper. Something that had been growing in the silence between them since the night she fell through his door. Something neither of them had spoken aloud because speaking it would make it real. And real things can be taken away, and both of them had already lost more than one person should have to. But it was there, in the way their hands fit together, in the way the silence between them did not feel empty anymore, in the way Elias looked at her and saw not a woman he had rescued, but a woman who had walked through fire and was still standing. The first clear spark of something that, if it survived the storm to come, might one day be called love. Neither of them was foolish enough to trust it yet. They had both loved before and lost, and they knew that love is not a shelter you step into, but a house you build with your hands, one board at a time, knowing the wind might take it before you finish. But the knowing did not stop the building. It never does. That is the stubborn miracle of the human heart, that it keeps reaching for warmth even after being burned, that it keeps opening doors even after being shut out in the cold. But the storm was coming. That much was certain. And this time it would not come from the sky. It would come wearing clean boots and a cold smile, and carrying papers signed in ink that had dried long before Clara Whitfield ever set foot in Montana. It would come with lawyers and laws and the terrible machinery of a system built by men who had never been left in the snow. And it would test every fence they had mended, every wall they had built, every quiet moment of trust they had earned in the weeks since winter broke. Elias squeezed her hand once. Clara squeezed back, and together they watched the clouds roll in from the west, dark and heavy and full of rain, the kind of sky that promises nothing good. But they did not go inside. They stood their ground. The rain came that night, not wild like the blizzard had been, but steady and relentless, the kind of rain that does not rage but simply refuses to stop. It drummed against the cabin roof in a rhythm that felt almost patient, as if the sky had all the time in the world and intended to use every minute of it. Water ran in thin streams from the eaves and pooled in the yard, turning the ground to dark mud that sucked at boots and held the tracks of everything that crossed it. Elias sat by the fire long after Clara climbed to the loft. He could hear her moving above him, the soft creak of the bed frame, the whisper of blankets being pulled and rearranged. She was not sleeping. He knew the sound of someone trying to sleep, and the sound of someone pretending to, and the sounds above him belonged to the second kind. He was not sleeping either. The law. Silas Drummond. Paper and signatures, and men who had never felt cold deciding the fate of a woman who had nearly died in snow. He stared into the flames and turned these things over in his mind the way a man turns a stone in his hand, feeling its weight, testing its edges, trying to understand what it might cost him if he set it down and what it might cost him if he did not. He had buried one wife already. He would not lose another woman to something he could fight. The thought arrived without warning, and with it a stillness that spread through his chest like water settling in a basin. Another woman. He had not called Clara that before, not even inside his own mind. But the word was there now, quiet and stubborn and impossible to unsay, and he let it sit because the truth, even the inconvenient kind, deserved to breathe. 3 days later, Clara found the box. She had been cleaning the loft. Not because Elias asked her to, but because she had made it her project, turning the dusty, neglected space into something livable, something that felt less like storage and more like a room where a person slept. She swept the floorboards, arranged the blankets, opened the small window to let the spring air push out the musty smell of years of disuse. And in the far corner, beneath a folded horse blanket that had not been moved since Elias placed it there 7 winters ago, she found a wooden box. It was plain. Pine, sanded smooth, with no lock and no decoration. The kind of box a man builds when he needs to keep something safe, but does not want to be reminded of what is inside. She lifted the lid carefully, the way you lift the cover of a book you suspect will change you, and what she found was a stack of letters tied with a piece of kitchen string. Lenore's handwriting, small and even and full of loops, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught penmanship in a schoolroom and never lost the habit. The letters were written to Elias during the months of her pregnancy, full of ordinary hopes and quiet plans, names they might choose, whether the baby would have his eyes or hers, how she wanted to plant a garden in the spring so the child would grow up knowing the smell of tomatoes warm from the vine. And at the bottom of the stack, one letter that was different, unfinished, written not to Elias, but to the child. It began with "my dearest little one," and stopped in the middle of a sentence, the ink trailing off as if the hand that held the pen had simply been called away. As if Lenore had set down the letter meaning to return to it and never did. Clara held that letter for a long time. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes did not fill. She simply held it and read it and understood. With the deep understanding of a woman who knew what it meant to lose the people who were supposed to stay, that this piece of paper was the heaviest thing in the cabin, heavier than the logs in the walls, heavier than the stone of the hearth, heavier than 7 years of silence, She did not hide it. She did not put it back. That evening, after supper, when the fire was low and the rain had softened to a whisper against the roof, she placed the wooden box on the table between them. She did not ask. She did not explain. She simply set it there, open, the letters visible, and waited. Elias looked at the box. His face changed the way a landscape changes when a cloud passes over the sun. Not suddenly, but completely. The light draining out of it until what remained was something raw and exposed and older than his years. He stared at the letters for a long time, long enough for the fire to crackle twice and settle, long enough for Boone to sigh and shift at their feet, long enough for the silence to become its own kind of conversation. Then he spoke. "She wrote them at night," he said. His voice was low, rough-edged, the voice of a man pulling words from a place he had kept locked. "After I fell asleep, she would sit at this table with the lamp turned down low and write. I did not know about them until after." He reached into the box and touched the unfinished letter with one finger, just touched it, the way you touch a bruise to remind yourself it is still there. The night she went into labor, the snow was already falling. I rode for the midwife, Mrs. Braddock, 3 miles north. By the time I got back, Lenore was on the floor. He paused. The midwife arrived 3 hours late. 3 hours. I have counted them 1,000 times, and they never get shorter. Clara did not move. She barely breathed. She understood that this was not a conversation to be joined, but a wound being unwrapped, and the only thing she could offer was the simple, enormous gift of not looking away. She held my hand, Elias continued. Squeezed it so hard, I thought the bones would crack. And then she stopped squeezing. And then she was lighter. And then she was gone. He swallowed. The baby never cried. I waited. I kept waiting. But it never came. That sound. The crying. The sound that is supposed to mean everything worked. Everything is all right. The world kept its promise. It never came. His eyes were wet. Not tears falling. Tears held. The kind that sit on the edge and refuse to drop, because the man holding them has spent 7 years learning how to keep them exactly there. I dug the grave in frozen ground, he said, with my hands. No gloves. The shovel kept hitting rock, and I could not feel my fingers. And I remember thinking that was fair, that my hands should hurt, that something should hurt on the outside because everything inside was already destroyed. Silence. The fire spoke in the language fires speak, crack, settle, glow. 7 years, Elias said quietly. Every morning I walked to that tree and I talked to her. Tell her about the weather, about the horses, about nothing. Because if I stop talking to her, it means she is really gone. And I have never been ready for that. Clara sat very still across the table. The lamplight lay soft on her face, on the dark hair that fell around her shoulders, on the hands folded in her lap. She did not reach for him. Not yet. She gave the silence its full weight, let it fill the room. Let it do what silence does when it is honored instead of feared. It became a space large enough to hold his grief without shrinking it. Then she spoke. "Loss does not leave," she said softly. "It only changes shape." Elias looked at her, really looked. Not the way a man looks at a woman he is grateful to or a woman he is beginning to care for, but the way a person looks at someone who has just spoken a language they thought no one else knew. "You speak like someone who knows," he said. "My parents died within 2 years of each other," Clara said. Her voice was steady but thin, the way a wire is steady but thin, holding weight it was never designed to carry. "My mother first. A fever that took her in 6 days. My father followed the next winter. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know what it really was. He simply stopped wanting to be here without her." She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table, as if steadying herself against something that might otherwise pull her under. "After that, I learned something. You do not outrun loss. You carry it. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, you find someone who helps you carry it." The words settled between them like embers falling from a fire, glowing, warm, full of a heat that would last longer than the flames that made it. Elias reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not bold, not claiming, just present. A hand saying, "I am here, and that is enough." Clara turned her hand beneath his and held on. It was the first time they had touched like this. Not because of cold, not because of fear, not because a horse was dying, or a fence was broken, or a blizzard was howling outside the door, but because they chose to. Because in this small cabin, beside this low fire, with the rain whispering against the roof, and the dogs sighing at their feet, and the letters of a dead woman lying open on the table between them, they chose each other. Outside, the last of the snow melted from the cottonwood behind the cabin. Water dripped from its branches in slow, steady drops that caught the moonlight like small falling stars. And for the first time since Lenore's grave had been covered in frost, Elias felt the earth thaw inside him too. The days that followed carried a different quality, like a room after someone has opened a window. The same walls, the same furniture, the same light, but the air was different. Something had moved through it and left it changed. They worked side by side now with an ease that surprised them both. Mending fence, they found a rhythm. Elias holding the post while Clara wrapped the wire. Their movements coordinated without words. Their hands passing tools back and forth in a pattern that felt practiced even though it was new. And sometimes, in the exchange, their fingers would brush. A moment. A touch. The barest contact of skin against skin, lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but carrying enough electricity to light the entire valley. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them needed to. Clara called him Elias now. Not Mr. Harding. Not Sir. Just Elias, spoken in her steady Boston voice. And every time she said it, he heard something in the way her mouth shaped the syllables that made him forget whatever thought he had been holding. Once, she said his name while handing him a cup of coffee, and he stood there with the cup in his hand for a full 5 seconds before remembering what it was for. In the evenings, she read aloud by the fire. He had grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to a season. Her voice had become part of the cabin's architecture, as essential as the hearth or the roof, something that held the whole structure together. But now he noticed something new. He was not listening to the stories anymore. He was listening to her. to the way her breath caught before a passage she loved, to the way her voice dropped low when the words carried weight, to the way she paused at the end of a page and looked up, and their eyes would meet across the room, and the fire between them would feel suddenly, impossibly warm. One evening she stopped mid-sentence, just stopped. The book lay open in her lap, and she looked at him, and he was looking at her, and the fire crackled, and neither of them spoke, and the moment stretched and stretched until it felt like a held breath that the whole cabin was sharing. Then Boone sneezed, and Clara laughed, and the moment broke like a soap bubble, gently and without damage, leaving behind only the memory of how it had felt to stand inside it. But Elias remembered. He would remember it for the rest of his life. Clara made cornbread one afternoon, round, golden, baked in the cast iron skillet she had scrubbed back to black, with a crust that crackled when she turned it out onto the cutting board. She had not planned it. She simply had cornmeal and buttermilk and the instinct her mother had given her, and the bread happened the way good things sometimes do, without intention, without effort, as if it had been waiting to be made. Elias cut a piece, took a bite, and stopped. His jaw worked slowly. His eyes went distant. The cornbread sat in his mouth, and for a moment he was not here. He was 7 years away, sitting at this same table, tasting a piece of round cornbread that Lenore had made on a Sunday afternoon while humming a song he could never remember the name of. The same golden crust. The same tender center, the same warmth that said someone cared enough to make something with their hands and set it before you. Clara did not know. She could not know. She sat across from him with flour on her wrists and a question forming on her lips, and he saw it coming, the "is it all right?" that she was about to ask, and he knew that if she asked it, he would have to explain. And explaining would mean opening a door he was not sure he could close again. So he ate the rest, slowly, without speaking. And when he was finished, he said, "That was very good." And his voice was steady, but his eyes were wet, and Clara saw it and did not ask why. She cleared the plates in silence, and in that silence, in the kindness of not pushing, in the grace of letting a man hold his grief without demanding he explain it, she gave him something no words could have given. She gave him room to feel without having to perform his feeling. And the cornbread sat between them on the table, round and golden and warm, connecting two kitchens that had never shared a wall, two women who had never met, two kinds of love that were not the same, but were made of the same flour. But the world outside the cabin had not stopped turning, and the warmth inside it was about to be tested. Silas Drummond did not rest. He moved through the town of Redstone the way a slow poison moves through water, invisible until the damage appears. He spoke to merchants and ranchers and anyone who would listen, and his story was simple and sharp and designed to cut. Clara Whitfield, he told them, had broken a lawful contract. Elias Harding was harboring another man's property. The law was clear. Paper was paper. Money had been exchanged. A deal was a deal. Some people listened and dismissed it. Some listened and wondered. And some, the ones who feared Drummond's money more than they valued their own judgment, began to pull away from Clara the way curtains close when someone undesirable walks past. Clara felt it. She felt it the way you feel a room grow colder when a draft slips beneath the door. Conversations that stopped when she entered the store. Eyes that met hers and then found somewhere else to look. A woman who crossed the street rather than share the same boardwalk. She stood in the middle of Redstone's main street one afternoon, her back straight, her chin level, and watched two women she had spoken with just last week turn their faces away from her as if she carried something contagious. She did not call after them. She did not cry. She stood there until they were gone, and then she walked to the wagon where Elias was waiting. "I have been discarded 3 times," she said, her voice flat and careful. The voice of someone holding a heavy thing steady by sheer force of will. By fate, by Drummond, and now by people who do not know the first true thing about me. She paused. But this time, I am not running. Elias watched her face. He saw the cost of those words in the tightness around her mouth and the stillness in her eyes. Standing was always harder than running. Running was momentum. Standing was choice. And choice required a kind of strength that left bruises no one else could see. "No," he said, "you are not." That night, something broke. Elias had fallen asleep by the fire, his head tilted against the chair back, the rifle resting across his knees. He had taken to sleeping downstairs since the marshal's visit, a habit Clara noticed but did not mention. The fire burned low. The cabin was dark except for the red glow of embers, and in the deepest part of that darkness, Elias dreamed. He dreamed of Lenore, of her standing at the window in morning light, one hand on her belly, turning to smile at him. And in the dream, as in life, he said her name, Lenore. The word left his lips softly, barely more than a breath. But in the silence of the cabin, it carried the way sound carries across still water. It rose through the floorboards and through the gaps in the loft planks and reached the ears of the woman lying awake above him. Clara heard it. She lay very still, her hands flat against the mattress, her eyes open in the dark. She heard the name of a dead woman spoken in the voice of a man she was beginning to love, and something inside her went cold. Not the cold of winter, the cold of doubt. The cold of a question she had been refusing to ask herself because she was afraid of the answer. Was he looking at her? Or was he looking through her, searching for the outline of someone who was no longer there? In the morning, she was different. Not angry, not cold, but careful. She kept a distance that had not been there the day before, a space of 2 feet that might as well have been 2 miles. She spoke when spoken to. She worked without pause. She did not read aloud that evening. She simply said she was tired and climbed to the loft early, and the cabin filled with the kind of silence that is worse than any argument because it gives you nothing to push against. Elias did not understand. He replayed the day in his mind, looking for the wrong step, the wrong word, the moment where the ground had shifted and found nothing. 3 days passed like this. 3 days of Clara beside him, but not with him, present in body and absent in everything else. 3 days of a cold he could not fix, because he did not know where it was coming from. On the 4th day, he asked her to walk with him. She hesitated. Then she nodded. He led her to the cottonwood behind the cabin, to the small wooden marker at its base. Lenore Harding, beloved wife, gone too soon. The letters were carved by hand, uneven but deep, made by a man whose grief was stronger than his skill with a chisel. They stood there together in the afternoon light. The tree was green now, its leaves full and trembling in a breeze that smelled like wet earth and new grass. Somewhere above them, a bird was singing, high and clear, the kind of song that sounds like it was written for exactly this moment. Elias spoke first. "She will always be here," he said. "She is part of this land, part of this cabin, part of me. I cannot take that back, and I would not want to." Clara stared at the marker. Her face was unreadable. But you, Elias continued, and his voice shifted, deepened, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the present. Clara, you are not a replacement. You are not a shadow. You are not the second version of something I lost. You are the thing I did not dare hope would come. Something entirely new. She looked at him then. Her eyes were bright with something she was fighting to contain, something that wanted to spill over but had been held back by 3 days of silence and doubt and the terrible fear of being a stand-in for a ghost. I heard you say her name, she said, in your sleep. Elias closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. I dream of her sometimes. I will probably dream of her for the rest of my life. She was my wife. She died in this cabin. Those things do not disappear because something new has grown. He paused. But dreaming of the past does not mean I am living in it. Not anymore. Clara's chin trembled. Just once. Then she steadied it, the way she steadied everything, with will and grace, and the quiet refusal to be anything less than whole. I do not want to replace her, she said. I just want to stand beside her, beside the memory of her, not in front of it, not behind it, beside it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves above them, making a sound like a whispered conversation in a language older than English. Then that is where you will stand, he said. Something eased between them. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for Clara to take a step closer. Enough for Elias to reach out and take her hand, gently, the way you pick up something you have been afraid to break. Enough for both of them to stand there beside the grave of a woman who had loved this land and this man and this life, and to feel not guilt, but gratitude for what had been, and for what, against all odds, was beginning again. They walked back to the cabin as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was warm now, the good kind, the kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full. That evening, Clara read aloud again, and Elias listened, and the cabin felt, for the first time, not like a place where someone had died, but like a place where someone was choosing to live. 5 days later, the marshal returned. Josiah Cragg rode up in the late afternoon, his coat dusty from the trail, and his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who has been asked to deliver news he wishes did not exist. He dismounted slowly and removed his hat and held it in both hands the way he always did when the weight of what he was about to say required something to hold on to. Judge is coming, he said. From Helena. 10 days, maybe less. Elias stood on the porch. Clara stood beside him. Between them, Boone sat with his ears forward, reading the tension in the air the way dogs do with a clarity that humans envy. If Drummond's contract is reviewed and the judge finds it binding, Cragg continued, Miss Whitfield could be ordered to return, or Drummond could claim damages. Either way, it goes to court, and courts are not kind to people without lawyers. Clara's hand found the porch railing. She gripped it hard enough that the wood creaked. But there is another way, Cragg said. He spoke carefully, now, choosing each word the way a man chooses his footing on ice. If Miss Whitfield were to marry someone else before the court reviews the contract, the original agreement becomes void under territorial statute. A lawful marriage overrides a prior arrangement that was never fulfilled. The word hung in the air. Marriage. It landed between Clara and Elias like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction, touching everything. Cragg looked at them both. He was not a man who enjoyed implications. He was a man who preferred straight roads and clear weather. But he had done what he came to do, and the rest was not his to decide. 10 days, he repeated. Then he put his hat on and mounted his horse and rode back down the trail, leaving behind a silence that was louder than anything he had said. Clara and Elias stood on the porch. The sun was low. The valley stretched before them in shades of gold and green, impossibly beautiful, impossibly fragile, like everything worth keeping. They looked at each other. And in that look, in the space between two people who had carried loss and found strength and built something quiet and real out of the wreckage of what the world had done to them, a question formed, unspoken, enormous, hovering in the spring air like the first warm breath before a summer that has not yet arrived. Neither of them answered it. Not yet. But neither of them looked away. Elias did not sleep that night. He sat at the table with the lamp turned low and the fire burned down to embers, and he thought about what it means to ask a woman to marry you when the asking is tangled up in law and fear and the shadow of a man who believes he owns her. He thought about Lenore, about the morning he had proposed to her in the kitchen of her father's house in Billings, with flour on his hands and his heart in his throat and nothing to offer her but a piece of land and a promise. She had laughed, not at him, at the flower. And then she had said yes, and the world had felt so simple he almost could not believe it was real. This was not simple. Nothing about Clara Whitfield was simple. She had come to him out of a storm, half dead, carrying the weight of a man's cruelty and the memory of a life that had offered her nothing but closed doors. And now he was going to ask her to walk through another door, one that led to a marriage born not from courtship and candlelight, but from necessity and a 10-day deadline and the grinding machinery of territorial law. He wanted to do it differently. He wanted wildflowers and a Sunday morning and the kind of silence that comes when two people have all the time in the world and choose to spend it together. He wanted to earn the moment instead of having it forced upon him by a man who did not deserve to force anything upon anyone. But life does not wait for perfect moments. Elias had learned that the night Lenore died. You do not get to choose when the important things arrive. You only get to choose what you do when they do. He found Clara in the morning by the chicken coop. She was scattering feed, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The chickens clustered at her feet in their anxious, bobbing way, and she moved among them with the quiet competence she brought to everything, as if she had been doing this her whole life instead of just a few weeks. Clara. She turned. Something in his voice must have told her this was not about the chickens, because her hand went still and the feed stopped falling and the birds milled around in confused circles at her feet. "Walk with me," he said. They walked away from the cabin, past the fence line, to the place where the ridge dropped away and the valley opened below them in a wide sweep of green and gold. The mountains rose in the distance, snow still clinging to their highest peaks, and the sky above was the kind of blue that only exists in places where the air is thin enough to let you see forever. Elias stopped. He faced her. His hands hung at his sides, calloused and empty, and he realized he had nothing to hold. No ring, no flowers, no carefully rehearsed words, just himself. Just the truth. And for a man who had spent 7 years hiding behind silence, the truth felt like the most terrifying thing he had ever carried. "I love you," he said. The words came out simply, without decoration, without preamble. They stood in the morning air between them like something newly built, plain and solid and unmistakable. "I have tried to keep distance," he continued, "because I did not want you to feel beholden to me. I did not want you to confuse gratitude with something else. I did not want to be the man who saved you and then asked for something in return. That is not who I am. That is not what this is." Clara stood very still. Her eyes were wide and bright and fixed on his face, with an intensity that made the valley around them disappear. "But I love you," he said again, "because some truths need to be spoken more than once before they feel real. And if marriage is what keeps you safe from Drummond, then I want you as my wife." Not because of his contract, not because of the judge, not because of paper or law or any of the things that men use to control what does not belong to them. He paused. "Because I cannot picture this land without you standing in it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full the way a held breath is full, packed tight with everything that wants to be said and everything that does not need to be. Clara looked at him, her lips parted. She blinked once, and a single tear slid down her cheek. But she was smiling, and the combination of those two things, the tear and the schweisel, created something on her face that Elias knew he would remember until the last day of his life. "I thought I imagined it," she whispered. "The way you look at me, when you think I am not watching, when you hand me a cup of coffee and your fingers stay a moment too long, when I read at night and I look up and you are already looking at me." She shook her head softly. "I thought I was seeing something that was not there because I wanted it so badly." "It is there," he said. "I know." Another tear, another smile. "I stopped fighting it weeks ago. I stopped the night you held my hand on the porch and I felt, for the first time since my parents died, like I was standing on solid ground." She took a breath, steadied herself, and then spoke the word he had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting for it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Elias Harding. I will marry you." He reached for her then, took both her hands in his. Her fingers were warm from the morning sun and slightly rough from weeks of work, and they fit inside his palms, the way a key fits a lock it was made for. "We do this right," Clara said, "not hiding, not in a back room with the curtains drawn, in daylight, where people can see." Agreed. They rode to the marshal's office before noon. Josiah Cragg looked up from his desk with an expression that was equal parts surprise and relief, the expression of a man who had delivered a problem and was grateful to see it being solved. "We would like to be married," Elias said. Cragg looked at Clara. "You are certain?" "I am." "Then I can perform the ceremony. Right here if you like." "No," Clara said. Both men looked at her. She stood straighter, which was something, because Clara Whitfield already stood straighter than most people Elias had ever known. "If we do this," she said, "we do it standing outside, in daylight, not hiding in fear." So they stepped out into the soft morning drizzle. The sky was pale and close. the air cool and damp, and the street was quiet except for a horse tied to the rail outside the general store and a dog sleeping in a patch of mud near the church steps. It was not the setting Elias had imagined. It was not flowers and Sunday light. It was a muddy street and a tin sky and a woman who had survived a blizzard standing beside him in a faded blue dress that had seen better days. And it was perfect. Because perfect has nothing to do with setting and everything to do with meaning. Cragg spoke the words with steady dignity. No frills, no crowd, just vows, just truth. Two people standing in the rain making promises that the weather could not wash away. Clara Whitfield, will you be my wife? I will. And you, Elias Harding, will you take this woman as your wife? I will. Then by the authority granted to me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Elias pulled her close. When he kissed her, it was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was a promise made with lips instead of words, slow and certain, and full of the kind of tenderness that only comes from a man who knows exactly what he has been given and exactly what he almost lost. And for the first time since the storm, Clara did not feel like something cast away. She felt chosen. Word traveled fast. By noon, half of Redstone knew that Elias Harding had married the woman Silas Drummond once claimed as his own. Some raised a glass. Some raised an eyebrow. Some waited. The way people wait when they know the third act of a play is not yet finished. Silas Drummond did not make them wait long. He rode into Cedar Hollow the following afternoon with 3 men behind him. They came up the trail in a line, slow and deliberate, the way men ride when they want you to see them coming and want you to have time to be afraid. Drummond sat his horse with the easy posture of a man who had never doubted his right to anything he wanted. His boots were polished. His coat was clean. He looked the way power looks when it has decided to stop pretending to be polite. Elias saw them from the fence line. He set down the post driver and walked toward the cabin without hurrying. He did not run. Running would mean fear, and fear was something he could not afford to show. Not now. Clara stepped onto the porch before he could tell her to stay inside. She stood there with her shoulders back and her hands at her sides and her chin raised, and Elias felt a surge of something that was equal parts admiration and terror, because the woman he had married 24 hours ago was not the kind of woman who hid behind walls. She was the kind who stood on top of them. They would face this together. Drummond dismounted slowly. His eyes traveled from Elias to Clara's left hand, where the ring caught the afternoon sun. It was not much of a ring. A simple band Elias had fashioned from a silver coin in the hours before the ceremony, hammered and shaped on the anvil in the barn. But it was real, and the law it represented was real. And Drummond stared at it the way a man stares at a door that has been locked against him. "So," he said softly, "you moved quick." "We married lawfully," Elias replied, "in front of the marshal." Drummond's jaw flexed. The muscle worked beneath the skin like something trying to break free. "You think that erases a signed contract?" he asked. "Money paid, agreement made." "You broke it," Clara said clearly. "You left me to die." Drummond did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Elias as if Clara were not worth the turn of his head. "I have lawyers in Helena," he continued. "A judge will review this. If your little ceremony is not airtight, Mrs. Harding will be coming home." "She is home," Elias said. The 3 men behind Drummond shifted on their horses. The valley was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Then Clara stepped forward, not behind Elias, beside him. Not beside him, In front of him, she looked directly at the man who had abandoned her in a blizzard and told her she was worthless and driven her into the snow like something to be discarded, and her voice when she spoke was the steadiest sound in the entire valley. "You mistake something," she said. "You never owned me. You never will. Not with paper. Not with money. Not with lawyers or judges or any power you think you hold. I walked through your storm, and I survived it. And I am standing here, and you cannot move me." Drummond's smile thinned until it was not a smile at all, but a line drawn across his face. "I gave you opportunity," he snapped. "A ranch. A future." "You gave me humiliation," Clara answered, "and a frozen road." For a moment, something dark and ugly passed through Drummond's expression, the real man behind the polished boots and the careful words, the man who measured people the way he measured cattle and discarded the ones that did not meet his specifications. Then it was gone, locked away behind the mask he wore for public consumption. "I will see you in court," he said. He mounted his horse. The three men turned with him. They rode back down the trail without looking back, and the sound of hooves faded into the valley until there was nothing left but wind and the call of a hawk circling high above the ridge. Clara exhaled. It came out of her in a long, shaking breath that she had been holding, Elias realized, since the moment the riders appeared on the trail. "It is not finished," she said softly. "No," Elias agreed. "But neither are we." The night was warm for spring, the air airing the first real hint of the summer to come. They ate supper in a silence that was not uncomfortable but watchful, two people listening to the world outside the cabin with the particular attention of those who know something is coming but do not know when. Clara washed the plates. Elias checked the windows and the door and placed the rifle beside the bed. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of two people who were now married but still learning what that meant, where the boundaries were, which spaces belonged to whom, how close was close enough, and how close was too much. Clara climbed to the loft. Elias spread his bedroll by the fire. Neither of them questioned the arrangement. There would be time for that. Time for the slow collapse of distance, the gradual merging of two separate lives into one. But tonight was not that time. Tonight the distance was a kindness they gave each other, a way of saying, "I chose you, and I will wait for you," and those are not contradictions. Elias was almost asleep when the smell reached him. Smoke. Not the smoke of a hearth or a cook fire or autumn leaves burning in a clearing. This was thicker, darker, wrong. It carried the sharp chemical bite of something accelerated, something that had been helped to burn faster and hotter than nature intended. He was on his feet before his mind caught up with his body. Through the window, he saw it. The barn. The entire south wall was engulfed, flames climbing the dry timber with a speed that seemed almost eager, as if the fire had been waiting for permission and had finally received it. Orange light pulsed against the darkness, throwing wild shadows across the yard. Sparks spiraled upward into the black sky like a swarm of furious stars. "Clara!" He was already moving toward the door. She appeared at the edge of the loft, hair loose, eyes wide, instantly awake. She did not ask what was happening. She could see the orange glow painting the cabin walls. She was down the ladder in seconds, pulling on boots, Grabbing the bucket by the door, Elias ran. The heat hit him 20 feet from the barn. It pushed against his face and chest like a living thing, a wall of blistering air that tasted of smoke and ash and destruction. Inside, the horses screamed. The sound was terrible, high and desperate. The sound of animals who understood what fire meant and could not save themselves. He pulled the barn door open. Smoke poured out in a black wave that blinded him instantly. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and went in anyway. Found Copper first, the old mare stamping and wild-eyed, her nostrils flaring. He grabbed her halter and pulled her toward the door, fighting against her panic, talking to her in a voice he hoped sounded steadier than he felt. He got her out, turned back. The second horse, a young gelding he had bought last autumn, was in the far stall. The fire had reached the hayloft above. Burning straw fell in clumps, landing on the ground in bright orange patches that spread immediately. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. Every breath felt like swallowing something sharp. He reached the gelding. The animal reared. Elias grabbed the halter and pulled. The horse fought him, twisting, kicking, blind with fear. Then the beam fell. It came down from the hayloft with a sound like a cannon shot, a massive pine timber engulfed in flame, and it struck Elias across the left shoulder and the side of his neck with a force that drove him to his knees. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white heat that erased everything else, every thought, every plan, every instinct except the primal need to get out. He lost his grip on the gelding. The horse bolted past him through the open door and into the night. Elias tried to stand. His left arm would not respond. The pain in his shoulder radiated outward in waves, each one worse than the last, and the smoke was so thick now that he could not see the door, could not see anything except the orange glow of fire and the black churn of smoke and the boards beneath his hands. Then hands found him. Small hands, strong hands. Hands that gripped his shirt and pulled with a strength that seemed impossible for their size. Clara. She had come into the burning barn. She had come in after him, the way he had opened his door to her on the night of the blizzard, without hesitation, without calculation, simply because someone she loved was in danger and leaving them there was not something she was capable of doing. She pulled him out, dragged him across the yard, away from the heat, away from the collapsing structure, and lowered him onto the cold ground. Behind them, the barn roof caved in with a roar that shook the earth. Sparks erupted into the sky in a fountain of orange and gold, and then it was over. The barn was gone. Clara knelt beside him. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat and the wild orange light of the dying fire. She pressed her hands against his shoulder, and he heard himself cry out, a sound he did not recognize, the sound of a body pushed past what it was designed to endure. "Stay with me," she said. The same words he had spoken to her on the night of the blizzard. "Stay with me, Elias." He tried to speak, coughed instead. The smoke had gotten deep into his lungs, and it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Clara tore a strip from her nightgown and pressed it against the burn on his shoulder. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. She had done this before, not with fire, but with crisis. She knew how to be steady when the world was not. The barn burned until there was nothing left to burn. The flames gave way to smoke, and the smoke gave way to a gray haze that hung over the homestead like a funeral veil. What remained was ash and ruin, and the feed, the tools, the saddle Elias had bought the year he married Lenore, the spare harness, the winter stores they would need in 6 months. All of it. Gone. No evidence, no witnesses, no proof that could be carried into a courtroom and laid before a judge. But they both knew. The way you know the direction of the wind without looking at a flag. The way you know rain is coming by the smell of the air. They knew. Silas Drummond had made his statement, and the statement was this: I will burn everything you have before I let you keep what I believe is mine. Clara helped Elias inside. She laid him on the bed, the first time he had slept there since Lenore died, and she cleaned the burn with water and the last of her dried herbs and bandaged his shoulder with strips torn from a clean sheet. He lay still beneath her hands, his jaw clenched against the pain, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the shadows of the fire still danced through the window. And then he broke. Not the shoulder, not the body. Something deeper. Something that had been holding since the night Lenore stopped breathing, and the baby never cried, and the world went silent in a way that silence should never sound. He wept. Not a single tear. Not the controlled, dignified grief of a man who has made peace with his losses. This was the other kind. The kind that comes from the deepest room in the house, the one with the locked door. The one you never open, because you know that what is inside will drown you if you let it out. I cannot lose anyone else, he whispered. His voice broke on the word lose, split it open, and what spilled out was 7 years of held grief and the raw, terrible fear of a man who had finally allowed himself to love again and now saw that love threatened by fire and law and the cruelty of a man who did not know how to be refused. I held Lenore's hand until it went cold, he said. I sat with her body until the lamp burned out. I dug a hole in frozen ground and I put her in it, and I told myself I would never do this again. I would never hold someone and lose them. I sealed the door. I nailed it shut. And then you came, and the door opened, and now I cannot close it, and I am terrified because everything I love burns. Everything I love dies. And I cannot do it again. His chest heaved. The words came in ragged bursts, torn from somewhere so deep they barely sounded like language. Clara sat beside him on the bed. She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart, and felt it hammering beneath her palm like something trying to escape. She lowered her forehead to his. The gesture was gentle and firm at the same time, an anchoring, a way of saying, I am here, and I am not going anywhere, without using a single word. You will not lose me, she said. I am here. I chose to be here. I chose you, Elias. Not your ranch. Not your protection, you, and I am not leaving. He reached up with his good hand and placed it over hers, pressing her palm harder against his chest, as if he could hold her there permanently, as if the pressure of 2 hands could seal a promise more binding than any contract Silas Drummond had ever signed. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. Outside, the last embers of the barn glowed in the darkness like the dying eye of something that had tried to destroy them and failed. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat beside Elias until his breathing steadied, and his grip on her hand loosened into the gentle hold of sleep. Then she rose. She stood at the window and looked out at the wreckage of the barn and the moonlit valley beyond it and the dark ridge where the trail bent south toward Drummond's land. She thought about running. Not because she wanted to, but because she owed herself the honesty of considering it. She could leave, ride east, disappear into a city where Silas Drummond's name meant nothing and Elias Harding's heart would be safe from the cost of loving her. She thought about it for exactly 1 minute. Then she closed the window and sat down at the table and began to think about something else entirely. The judge was coming. The law was coming. And Clara Whitfield Harding, the woman who had walked through a blizzard and survived, who had saved a poisoned horse with her mother's herbs, who had faced down the man who abandoned her without flinching, was not going to wait for the law to come to her. She was going to meet it. At dawn, while Elias still slept, Clara put on her boots, tied back her hair, saddled Copper, and rode into Redstone alone. She did not go to the saloon. She did not go to the marshal's office. She went to the home of Prudence Loomis, the woman who had given her that single firm nod in the general store weeks ago. She went to Mr. Halford, who had muttered, "Drummond showed his true colors," on the day she first told her story. She went to every person in that small town who had seen her stand straight and speak true, and she asked them for the only thing she had ever asked anyone for: the truth, spoken aloud, before a judge. She did not beg. She did not weep. She did not perform the role of the helpless woman seeking rescue. She stood in their kitchens and on their porches, and she told them what had happened and what she needed, and she did it with the same quiet dignity she had carried since the night she walked out of a blizzard and refused to die. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, she had her witnesses. And when she rode back to the cabin, the morning light warm on her face and the valley stretching wide and green before her, she carried something more powerful than any contract Silas Drummond had ever signed. She carried the truth and the courage to speak it. Elias was standing on the porch when she returned. His shoulder was bandaged. His face was pale. His eyes, when they found her riding up the trail, held something she had not seen in them before. Not relief. Something larger than relief. Something that looked like the expression of a man who has just realized that the woman he married is not the woman he thought he was protecting, but a woman who was perfectly capable of fighting her own wars and had simply been waiting for the right one. "Where did you go?" he asked. Clara dismounted. She looked at him with steady eyes, the same eyes that had looked up at him from the floor of this cabin on the night she almost died. "To build our case," she said. "The judge arrives in 3 days, and when he does, I will be ready." She walked past him into the cabin. Elias watched her go, and despite the pain in his shoulder and the ash still drifting across the yard and the ruin of everything he had built over 12 years of solitary work, he felt something rise inside him that was stronger than all of it. He felt certain. Not that they would win. Certainty about outcomes is a luxury that life rarely offers. But certain that whatever came next, the woman who had just ridden through his door was not someone the world could break. It had tried. It had failed. And it would fail again. Judge Whitaker arrived on a Tuesday morning in a black coat that looked too heavy for spring and spectacles that caught the light like polished stones. He set up court in Redstone's town hall, a narrow building with plank floors and tall windows that usually hosted harvest dances and church socials. That day, it held silence. Silas Drummond sat at one table with 2 lawyers from Helena, Their papers were stacked with the precision of men who believed the world could be controlled by ink and signatures. Drummond himself sat very still, his jaw set, his eyes moving slowly around the room as if measuring every person in it and calculating what they owed him. Clara sat opposite, alone. The chair beside her was empty. Elias had tried to stand that morning, and the pain had driven him back to the mattress, his face gray, his breathing shallow. She had pressed her hand to his forehead and said, "I will do this. Rest." He had tried to argue. She had not let him. She had kissed his forehead, taken Copper down the trail, and ridden into Redstone by herself, carrying nothing but the truth and the names of every person who had agreed to speak it. The townspeople filled every bench. Prudence Loomis in her gray dress, back straight as a fence post. Mr. Halford with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead. Ranchers who had shared winter feed when cattle ran thin. Women who had watched Clara from behind curtains and now sat in the open, having chosen their side. Even Marshal Cragg stood near the wall, hat in hand, his presence a quiet declaration that the law was watching, and the law would not look away. The lawyers spoke first. They presented the contract, the letters, the receipt for passage money. They spoke of obligation and agreement and the binding nature of a signed document, and their words filled the room the way cold air fills a house when someone leaves the door open, gradually and without warmth. Then Clara stood. She did not tremble. Her hands did not shake. She rose from the bench the way she had risen from the floor of Elias Harding's cabin on the night she almost died, with effort and dignity and the absolute refusal to remain down. "He abandoned me in a blizzard," she said. Her voice carried to every corner of that narrow room. "Left me on a frozen road 1 mile from his homestead in the worst storm this territory has seen in a decade. He told me to walk. He did not look back. Whatever paper he carries, whatever signatures he presents, they mean nothing compared to that." The room was still. Judge Whittaker adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Drummond with the careful expression of a man who has heard many lies and has learned to recognize the truth by the sound it makes when it enters a room. "Mr. Drummond," he said, "did you leave this woman on a winter road during a blizzard?" Drummond's jaw flexed. "I corrected a mistake." "A mistake," the judge repeated slowly, "or an act of cruelty?" Drummond did not answer. The silence answered for him. Prudence Loomis stood next. She spoke briefly and without sentiment. She described Clara's character, her honesty, her willingness to stand in front of a town full of strangers and tell the truth without flinching. She described what she had seen and what she believed, and when she finished, she sat down with the same economy of motion with which she had risen. Mr. Halford confirmed that Clara had introduced herself truthfully from the first day. Marshal Cragg stepped forward and confirmed the marriage, lawful and properly recorded. His voice was steady. His words were precise. He was a man doing his duty, and his duty, on this day, aligned with what was right. Judge Whittaker leaned back. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Contracts," he said carefully, "are binding only when both parties act in good faith. Abandonment under life, threatening conditions, voids such good faith." He paused. The room held its breath. As for the marriage between Elias Harding and Clara Whitfield, now Clara Harding, it stands lawful and binding under territorial statute. The gavel struck once. The sound was small but final. The sound of a door closing on something that would not be opened again. This court finds in favor of the Hardings. The room exhaled. Clara's breath left her all at once, 7 weeks of held fear releasing in a single moment. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, and she lowered her head, just for a moment, just long enough to let the weight of what had happened pass through her. It was done. She had done it. Alone. Drummond rose. His face was the color of ash. "This is not over," he said, his voice hoarse and stripped of its usual polish. Judge Whitaker's gaze did not waver. "It is, Mr. Drummond. Leave this valley before you embarrass yourself further." Drummond stared at Clara one last time, but this time there was no power in his eyes, no possession, no threat. Only the hollow expression of a man who had mistaken ownership for love and was now discovering, too late, that the two have nothing in common. He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him, and Clara watched him go with something quieter than anger, quieter than triumph. Release. Then a sound from the back of the room, the creak of a heavy door opening. Footsteps. Slow and uneven, the steps of a man walking through pain he had no intention of acknowledging. The crowd turned. The aisle parted. Elias Harding stood in the doorway of the town hall, his left arm in a sling, his face pale as paper. His shirt buttoned wrong because he had dressed with one hand. He had saddled the gelding with his teeth and his good arm, and ridden 3 miles of rutted road with a burned shoulder because the woman he loved was standing in a courtroom alone, and that was something he could not allow, no matter what his body had to say about it. He had arrived late. He had arrived anyway. Clara saw him and her composure, the composure she had held through testimony and verdict and the long, terrible weeks of uncertainty, finally broke. Not into weakness, into fullness. Her eyes filled and her chin trembled, and she crossed the room and pressed her face against his chest, and he wrapped his good arm around her and held on. "You should not have come," she said. "There is no place on this earth I should be except right here," he answered. She looked up at him. "We are free." He kissed her, gently, right there in the crowded hall, with the whole town watching, with the gavel still echoing, with the spring light pouring through the tall windows and falling across them both like a blessing neither had asked for and both had earned. "Yes," he said, "we are." Summer came full and golden. Grass rose tall in the valley. Wildflowers spread in quiet bursts of color along the hills, purple and yellow and white, painting the landscape with the casual generosity of a season that does not need to try. The river ran clear and steady, strong enough to sing against the stones. Neighbors came to rebuild the barn. They arrived without being asked, the way neighbors do when they have watched someone survive something and decided that survival deserves company. They brought timber and nails and food, and for 3 days the valley rang with the sound of hammers and the low hum of people working together towards something good. Prudence Loomis brought pie. Mr. Halford brought hinges. The barn rose plank by plank, and with it, something else. A community that had watched from behind curtains was now standing in the open sun, choosing to be counted. Word came that Silas Drummond had sold his ranch and left the territory. No farewell, no apology, just absence. Clara listened to the news without reaction. She had already forgiven him in the only way that mattered, by refusing to let him define her. One evening, Clara stood before the small wooden marker beneath the cottonwood. Lenore Harding, beloved wife, gone too soon. I never wanted to replace her, Clara said softly. Elias stood beside her. You never did. She traced the carved letters with gentle fingers. She gave you love first. That matters. It does, he said, and so does what came after. Clara reached for the shawl she had brought from the cabin. Lenore's shawl, pale blue wool, thin at the edges. She lifted it and draped it across her own shoulders for the first time. Not taking, receiving. Accepting the legacy of a woman she had never met, but whose love still lived in the walls of the cabin and the heart of the man beside her. Elias watched, and what he felt was not grief. It was peace. That night they sat on the porch. Fireflies rose from the grass in slow, drifting points of light. Clara took his hand and placed it on her belly. She did not speak. She did not need to. His fingers spread across the warmth, and his eyes found hers, and what passed between them was too large for language. A man who had lost a child that never breathed. A woman who had been told she was not enough. And now, between them, beneath his hand, the quiet promise of something new. He smiled. She smiled. And the tears that came were the good kind, the kind that carry joy instead of sorrow, the kind you do not wipe away, because they are proof that you are still capable of being surprised by your own life. Do you know why I knocked on your door that night? Clara asked. Because you saw the light. She shook her head. I had stopped walking. I was on my knees in the snow and I was ready to stop, to let the cold take me, to be done. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. Then I saw the light in your window, and I thought, one more step, just one more, and then another, and then I was at your door. She looked at him. You did not just open a door, Elias. You were the reason I took the last step. He could not speak. He pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her forehead, and held her there, on the porch of the cabin he had built for a family that had been taken from him, while the fireflies rose, and the valley breathed, and the cottonwood whispered overhead in a language that sounded, if you listened carefully, like forgiveness. Years later, the people of Cedar Hollow would point to that cabin on the rise and speak of love forged in winter, of a woman who refused to be owned, of a man who chose courage over silence. They would tell the story the way all good stories are told, with added detail and borrowed wonder, and the certainty that comes from knowing how it ends. But the truth was simpler. A door opened. A life was spared. Two people who had been broken by the world found in each other the reason to keep standing, and the valley remembered. It always remembers.